the cloud. All right, we are recording. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're going to have a wonderful afternoon today with Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff and Rabbanit Sara Wolkenfeld. Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff is the Chief Academic Officer of Hebrew Theological College in Skokie and Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College. He's the author and editor of many books, including the one he is going to tell us a little about today, which is Authentically Orthodox, Tradition-Bound Faith in American Life. He's going to talk a little about women's Talmud study and have a conversation with Rabbanit Wolkenfeld about that. So without further ado.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I'm going to share my screen. And here we are. And I want to preface by, number one, thanking my friends. Really, the community of Anshe Shalom has been incredibly welcoming. Been so privileged to have so many great conversations and think deeply. More poignantly, I've said this before, I don't think in her presence, but if there's anybody's Olam Haba, their merit of the world to come that I'm envious of, it's Sara Wolkenfeld. The amount of Torah that you are the catalyst for to so many different groups. It's uncanny, it's unconscionable, it's really something to behold.
Thank you.
And I don't see this really, but what that really betokens is that while certainly this represents a chapter in my book, Women's Talmud in American Orthodox Judaism, particularly focusing my chapter does on the endeavors of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, I'm hoping to learn from you, Sarah, as much as I can share my own thoughts on the matter. So I hope that this is going to be a really fruitful conversation. So I want to position sort of what my book attempts to do. My book is, in some sense, trying to disrupt the narrative. The narrative being that, and I think this is something that you can track back to the great historian at Hebrew University, Jacob Katz, which is that Orthodox Judaism, or any tradition-bound faith, can be plotted quite linearly. From all the way to the left, you have modernity. From all the way to the right, you have tradition. At least that's my left and my right. I'm not sure how it's appearing on the screen. And Orthodox Judaism can be plotted, really all forms of Judaism can be plotted along this axis over here, orthodoxy being the closest item to tradition, and moving as you further towards modernity, as if there are these two poles, and it could be so easily plotted. Sam Heilman, in his book, now about 15 years old, but still is relevant, I think, he coined the phrase sliding to the right. And in this book, he writes the following: the purpose of this volume, then, is to examine these developments in the contest, within American Orthodoxy at the beginning of the new century. That was the 21st century. In particular, I seek to understand what was thought once to be the type of Jewish life and practice most ill-suited to, and at odds with, America. Haredi Orthodoxy, or a term that I prefer to call it the yeshiva world or the Orthodox right. I think that Haredi Orthodoxy signals something more pervasive in Israel, has managed to secure itself here, and how the trend of Orthodoxy, once believed to be best fitted to survive here, that is modern Orthodoxy, now finds itself losing the ideological battle for survival. Frum is giving way to frumer. And this idea, and what he offers is that from the sense of religious practice, particularly with women's issues, and certainly there's much gender in the issue, in the historical issue of women's Talmud, demonstrate how Orthodoxy is shifting, if you take those poles, away from modernity, closer and closer to tradition. So Other colleagues, though, have argued differently, and I should actually go back, is that what this image over here is a tract that was quite popular when I was in Israel. Is a little pamphlet called A Parent's Guide to Orthodox Assimilation on University Campuses, authored by two PhDs at Ivy League schools at the time, arguing to Orthodox parents that Hillel and other elements within the standard college campus are not to be trusted. And it was really, if anything, it was a pitch for the yeshiva colleges at that time. I think, Sarah, you were already leading Princeton at that time. Were you there already?
I was going to say my niche there, I was not there yet, but I did go to high school with one of the authors who's a few years ahead of me in high school. So I knew him before he had been corrupted, I guess, before he could live to tell the tale of this, this pamphlet that he wrote. I had already graduated in Penn. Yeah. Right.
In JLIC, though, which you helped lead the Princeton campus with your husband, was sort of that remedy in some sense to that contagion almost of what this book is. That's again, it receives a little bit of treatment in the Heilman book. I thought it was a really good image to share. Can't find that PDF. I have it though. Anybody wants to have a copy. The other side, of course, is sliding to the left. Is Yehuda Turetsky and Chaim Waxman. Our hypothesis is, and they're writing in 2011, 5 years after Heilman, is that American Orthodox Jewry is much more heterogeneous than the above-cited observers perceived. That the modern Orthodox sector in particular is neither of one stripe nor has it overwhelmingly Haredeized, and indeed, there have been some developments indicating significant ritualistic departure not only from Haredi norms and values, but from traditional Jewish religious behavior as well. And here you have the very first International Jofa Conference in the late 1990s. They thought they were going to receive about 200 audience members. In the end, they received closer to 800. Had much to do with a young girl's bat mitzvah being banned in Queens. That helped the numbers spike. It's maybe a different topic. It's in the book as well. And so you have this you have this tension of, on one hand, parts of Orthodox Judaism are sliding to the right and others are sliding to the left. And in observing this and working through so much of this literature, and being troubled by how to make sense of tradition-bound faith, and Orthodox Judaism is certainly an exemplar of that, but I include Calvinist faiths, I include Catholicism, in some sense the Church of Latter-day Saints as well. It's being pulled in multiple directions. What I argue, and what I think what's going to be very fruitful for this discussion, is that it's not really about moving to the left or to the right or anything two-dimensional, but it's rather three-dimensional. It's about striking a balance in a particular realm, whether it's political, social, within the position of gender and Zionism, that what works for tradition-bound faith is striking in the perception. Not to say that I'm offering a normative statement here, but for the historical actors, what feels authentic. Not what most closely approximates the practices of Moses or the Gaon of Vilna, but what feels in its American context. In America, authenticity is very, very important. For religion, for politics, what strikes a balance, what feels right, to paraphrase the French sociologist Regina Bendix, is that chord of authenticity that needs to find a sort of a sweet spot. And I think some of the sources that Sarah and I are going to review today are going to show, hopefully, bear out that the challenges for the champions of women's Talmud is to take all of the luggage that comes in tow and all of the political atmosphere that is embedded underneath, and to convince a population that this too is authentic. So at least in the 1950s, women's Talmud seemed very authentic. Here is a young girl. I've never been able to identify her or the Masechah that she's learning. I think it's Beitza. I think just looking at the width of the folio, the depth of it, that it's Beitza. But this is a young girl studying at Yeshiva Moshe Soloveitchik in Manhattan. And the image comes from the Orthodox Union Jewish Life in the 1950s. So it appeared in a magazine of the Orthodox Union. And it seemed quite natural. It seemed quite authentic. One image, the image on the left, though, is an important text. It's from the edited collection of letters of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the great modern Orthodox rabbinic figure, Talmud scholar, lecturer, philosopher. For about 4 decades, the leading personality at Yeshiva University and within other orbits of the American Orthodox arena. We have a letter from him dated May 1953, writing to Rabbi Leonard Rosenfeld, who sat on the education committee at High, what is now HAFTR, essentially. And this is the last piece of the correspondence. Dear Rabbi Rosenfeld, please accept my apologies for not answering your letter sooner. The delay was due to my overcrowded schedule. As to your question with regard to a curriculum in a co-educational school, I expressed my opinion to you long ago that it would be a very regrettable oversight on our part if we were to arrange separate Hebrew courses for girls. Not only, and this is the crucial matter at hand, not only is the teaching of Torah Shebaal Peh to girls permissible, on one hand it's mutter, argues Rabbi Soloveitchik, but it is nowadays an absolute imperative. Not just mutter, it's an achrayus, to use rabbinic parlance. This policy of discrimination, and in 1953 the word discrimination meant a heck of a lot, this policy of discrimination between the sexes as to subject matter and method of instruction, which is still advocated by certain groups within our Orthodox community, has contributed greatly to the deterioration and downfall of traditional Judaism. Boys and girls alike should be introduced into the inner halls of Torah Shebaal Peh, meaning Talmud. I hope to prepare in the near future a halachic brief. Unfortunately, I understand that such a volume, a tract was never furnished on the problem, which will exhaust the various aspects of the same. In the meantime, I heartily endorse a uniform program for the entire student body, so highlight, which was boys and girls. The question was, as we can intuit, if we have co-education, should we make sure that the girls learn Gemara as well? The answer from Rabbi Soloveitchik was not just sure, it was you must do that. This correspondence was preceded with Rabbi Soloveitchik guaranteeing that if he offered his position that it would be followed. Unfortunately, it wasn't followed for Rabbi Soloveitchik. But I want to throw this to you, Sarah. Rabbi Soloveitchik's not making a theological statement. He's making an educational one. And he's, as I understand his words, Rabbi Soloveitchik is suggesting that a curriculum without Talmud in 20th century America was somehow incomplete to train people to be fully Jewishly literate.
Yeah, I am reminded of what S.D. Rosenberg said at, I know we're going to get to this eventually, but what S.D. Rosenberg said at the Siyam Hashas for women, the Hadron event in January. She said something like, she thought that her father's stance on Talmud Torah for women. Yeah, sorry, her father of Aaron Lichtenstein's Etzel, that his belief that Torah Shebaal Peh, that Talmud study should be part of also a women's curriculum, she felt had less to do with how he felt about women and more to do with how he felt about learning Gemara, learning Torah. And that's what strikes me about this. That's how I've always felt in reading Rabbi Soloveitchik's work, that he really couldn't imagine a robust religious life that didn't include Gemara. And so like if he couldn't imagine it for men, he couldn't imagine it for women either. And I think it's not just like you said, it's a pedagogic point, not a theological point. I think it's also sort of pedagogical and practical in some way. Like you couldn't possibly have a real curriculum without that. I hear that in what he's saying. And I also want to connect this back to your initial points about authenticity, which I found really helpful as a framing. I kept going back to your introduction in reading through the book, because I think it's so interesting that Rav Soloveitchik, you said, he never did prepare this halachic this halachic treatise to justify this decision. And you can tell me what you think. I don't think it would have made a difference. I don't know if it would have made a difference. I think that all the halachic sources in the world, there are other sources you have that are halachic. In this slideshow, out of this slideshow, I think that ultimately it's really a conversation about authenticity, going to so much more than just the sources. So such that authenticity is not just rooted in, can you prove that it's acceptable? There's something beyond that you have to prove to make this acceptable. That's really an interesting point for me.
It's also interesting that Rabbi Soloveitchik never learned in a traditional yeshiva setting. He had correspondence with his grandfather, Chaim Brisker. He learned day and night with his father, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, but he never did spend a good amount of time in Volozhin or Slobodka, as so many of the European extracts who came to the United States, had done. And so Rabbi Soloveitchik was unfamiliar with that, that very gendered, very masculine space. And I wonder, not that he was ignorant of it, but I wonder because he never did position himself inside of it, he could never account for, which is so much, I want to sort of put a framing on this as well, is that in the 1950s, one could not help but think that engaging in a Talmud curriculum was treading on male space. Men learn Gemara, women do not. And rather, and some people have written on this from the standpoint of, can we contextualize this onto feminism? And I think there's much merit to that, but where my thinking comes onto this is that, what about masculinity? Is the response to women's Talmud, in part, not a fear of an encroachment onto traditional male space? And one area, and Sarah, you pushed us to think more deeply about it from the other standpoint, is what about in leadership training? Where so much of, within the Orthodox community, leadership isn't necessarily by going to the Kennedy School at Harvard, but it is doing your due diligence of being the mole kreso b'basar v'yayin, so to speak, filling yourself up with the stuff of Talmud study that makes you into a religious leader within the Orthodox community, and availing women to that. Are you not also challenging the positioning and the orientation of Jewish leadership?
Yeah, I as I told you, I think that's I think that ultimately all of the attempts, and I think you kind of showed this in the book, that all of the attempts to decouple women's Talmud study from religious leadership ultimately failed. And I think maybe I mean failed in a positive way in some sense here, that they can't actually be totally decoupled. At least in America, it didn't work that way.
Right.
It doesn't work that way.
Right, and I want to throw out there is that by coalescing this, by merging the curricula, in the pathway to women's leadership in the Orthodox world has to pass through Talmud education. You could not create, if women were to have a leadership position in many circles, then they needed to absorb that culture of Talmud.
Sure, and then paradoxically, it gets used against you, right? Because if you need to be a leader in the Orthodox world, you need to learn Talmud, but the point at which you've learned Talmud, you're not really Orthodox, so
Right.
we got a little stuck there.
Right, and to say, to foreshadow a little bit, is that Nechama Leibovich, for example, while there's no question that she opened up a folio of Talmud in her lifetime, she was able to become probably the singular female Orthodox scholarly personality, somebody that in Jerusalem Post articles indicated that men, rabbinic figures, would stand up when she walked into a room. She was able to present herself in such a way where she was a scholar, an educator, a leader, and yet, although she certainly knew Talmud, but her outward presentation was not awash in a Talmud curriculum. That could not have happened in the United States when you can, with this text that we're looking at right now, with this text or with this image to the right.
Yeah.
It's also happening at a very important moment. When our family came to Anshe Shalom, when everything was a little more normal, months ago, I rehearsed some of these sources with the community, but just in case anybody doesn't remember. The history of Bat Mitzvah in the United States is also happening at the very same time. And in the 1950s, Bat Mitzvah was co-signed to conservative Judaism. It was unheard of in most circles, particularly in New York, that Orthodox congregations should host Bat Mitzvahs. And if you look, it's one of the pieces of ammunition for Rabbi Pinchas Teitz, the chief rabbi of Elizabeth, New Jersey. You have the source on the top, and then Rabbi Eliezer Silver, so the unofficial chief rabbi of Cincinnati. Both, when they list all of the violations of conservative Judaism on traditional Jewish faith, they enumerate a number of items, mixed eating, other things, but also Bat Mitzvah figures prominently into their vituperative excoriations. In the Jewish Observer, let me make sure that our heads aren't blocking it, in an article, How Good is Your Day School, there is a checklist to rate your local day school. Day schools were becoming a fad, so to speak. The numbers were spiking quite a bit in the 1950s. The day school movement had just a couple dozen in the 1940s, and by 1960s there were hundreds of mostly Orthodox Jewish day schools, helped by Torah Masora, which was affiliated with the Orthodox Rite for the most part. And there's this checklist, very handy-dandy checklist. Religious studies are offered in the morning, check yes or no, your box. And if you take a look at curriculum, no use is made of abbreviated Chumashim or other Hebrew textbooks contrary to halacha. Okay, so you have to have the unabridged Chumash, that makes sense. The course of studies proceeds directly the Aleph Beis through Siddur to Chumash. Okay, so there's a Siddur party in first grade, there is a Chumash party in the second grade. The boys' curriculum leads to and emphasizes Gemara, and the girls' curriculum excludes it. It doesn't say here that the boys' curriculum focuses on Gemara and the girls' curriculum focuses on Navi. It doesn't focus on the positive aspects, the affirmative aspects of the curriculum. It is that the girls' curriculum excludes Talmud, yes or no. And so in the yeshiva world, they are already feeling the heat of women's Talmud. They don't know that private letter from Rabbi Soloveitchik, but certainly they know about Maimonides School, which Rabbi Soloveitchik and his wife, Dr. Tonya Soloveitchik, founded in Brookline, Massachusetts, first in Roxbury, then moved to Brookline, Massachusetts. They're offering women's Talmud. They hear rumblings about it at Yeshiva Flatbush that's offering it. Very few schools are doing it, but it's signaling something, maybe a sea change in the yeshiva world. Is forming a checklist to ensure that their schools and their readers oppose it.
I'm curious, Zev, about the interplay between the curriculum. You can go on to the next slide, it's relevant to both of them, but kind of the interplay between the curricular choices and also the co-educational piece, because I was struck in that Rav Soloveitchik letter. I mean, not because I know he was instrumental in founding Maimonides, but sort of struck that it's, in your coeducational curriculum, you should include Talmud for men and for women. I think it wasn't until I went to Midrash at Lindenbaum when I was 18 that I discovered how few actually fully coeducational Orthodox schools, like yeshiva high schools, existed in America. Like I thought all the high schools were pretty much like mine. I went to Frisch. It's not a true story. And so I'm curious what you know about the history of that piece.
So Torah Masora, according to Alvin Schiff's book, The Day School in America, Torah Masora issued a recommendation against coeducation in the 1950s. But for a variety of reasons, there were very few single-sex days. So obviously, Beis Yaakov and the yeshiva, so Torah Das had a high school, still does. Chaim Berlin, Mississippi Chaim Berlin has its own school, but most of the day school, quad day schools in the United States were being founded as co-educational, mostly for I think it didn't get to the point of an ideological discourse because the finances did not permit for single-sex education. So you have a couple of examples. Baltimore has Talmudical Academy, MTA, but of course Central emerges later on. Yeshiva University High School for Girls. But in the 1940s, most of the schools that are founded take what was called the Jewish Academy of Chicago, now Ida Crown, were founded as co-ed. Yeshiva Flatbush, Maimonides, Ramaz. That made good financial sense. Also because you had a lot of families who were not what was called a long time ago the non-observant Orthodox Jew. You had many families that would drive to shul on Shabbos. They weren't adhering to the 1950 Rabbinical Assembly responsive for the conservative movement. They were just driving to shul on Shabbos. They would never set foot, though, in a conservative or Reform synagogue. They would only daven, they only pray in an Orthodox congregation, and they were persuaded to send their children to an Orthodox day school, although they would not fit from a day-to-day religious behavior standpoint with the way that I think most rank-and-file Orthodox Jews would today. But these people also wanted co-education. If they were going to want an alternative to public school, they were going to want it, they would want their children in a co-ed day school. One of the seedier points, and Rabbi Soloveitchik alluded to that with the words segregation, is that day schools become popular, in part, not because of this, but one of the sidelights for the emergence of the Orthodox day school movement was that many were living in the suburbs, and with Brown versus Board of Education declaring that segregated schools would be unconstitutional, the option to maintain the status quo, 1950 and prior, was to move to private schooling. And as Orthodox Jews wanted to present themselves as part of an upper middle class, then public school wasn't an option. They needed to register their children in private schools because that's what you did if you were white and upper middle class. And with the day school movement, it made good sense to send them. In one of the most popular schools was, of course, Ramaz. I think our faces are perhaps blocking the image, so I'll move it here in the middle. In 1968, Associate Principal Rabbi Haskell Lookstein writes about the happy occasion that Ramaz is about to launch an honors program in Talmud for selected qualified students who are both deserving of participation in such program and interested in it. It's going to be taught by, under the direction of, in the second paragraph, Rabbi Julius Parnas, a celebrated Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University. He's much more well known as Rabbi Yehuda Parnas. He's also the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Lander College for Men. And he was hired to direct and to teach the Ramaz. Ramaz is a co-ed school. There seems to be rather gender-neutral language in the letter, but if you take a look at the registration card on the right, you'll see, I hereby request that my son/daughter be registered for the Talmud Honors Program. So Ramaz and Rabbi Parnas were teaching co-education. We're teaching both boys and girls Gemara at Ramaz as early as the late 1960s. Stern College figures very prominently, a smaller school still at this time, but an important school. And the students are agitating for a Talmud curriculum. They have a class in Talmud where they learn it was called Talmudic literature. But they wanted something with much more depth, with chana, with preparation, a seder. They wanted a seder in Gemara study. And the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, the Stern Observer, makes very clear here in some of these texts that there's a groundswell for it. Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, he doesn't spell his name that way, is the new dean of the Rebel Graduate School, recognized the necessity of intensive Jewish learning to be open to young women on a college level. It is a daring venture, so they know that this is something controversial, for it opens new options to women that have never before been approached by normative halakha. And there, it's interesting is that Rabbi Soloveitchik is calling an educational decision, and yet the messaging is getting bullocks already by the proponents of it, by trying to discuss it as a halachic or a religious issue. The proposal is commendable in every respect, and the general reaction among the student body has been a mixture of surprise. Rabbi Lamb, who has been president of Yeshiva University, fortunately it's my first time saying in class, he is Yeshiva University. He is the young president, still in his 40s. He has just hired a new dean, Karen Bacon, who is still the dean of Stern College. He has appointed Chaim Soloveitchik, Dr. Soloveitchik, to be the dean of Rebel Graduate School at the time. Rabbi Berman is here as the head of Judaic Studies. So it's a new guard at Stern College, and they are going to initiate a Talmud curriculum on the Midtown campus. And it's even been talked about on the men's campus. What's in one of the men's newspapers, the Reitz newspaper, the Soy newspaper, so of the yeshiva program at Yeshiva College. The interviewer asked, what's going on? And Dean Jacob Rabinowitz, first thing that comes to mind is that he and Rabbi Berman are working to improve Talmudic studies at Stern College. So it's in the air. It's being much discussed at Yeshiva University. And here is the pamphlet, a very important image that we'll see again in a moment, of Rabbi Soloveitchik delivering the inaugural Talmud lecture at the Stern Beit Midrash. And that's a statement, right? They could have called it so much of authenticity is about language. They could have called it a class. They could have called it a double or a triple period. They could have given 14 credits of credit hours to achieved by fulfilling the requirements in this class. Instead, they call it a new beginning. And here you have a new era in Jewish education for women began on October 1977 with Stern College for Women inaugurating its Beit Midrash program. So they're not calling it a yeshiva program, but they are calling it a Beit Midrash program. And that messaging, I think, is really, really important. Here you have Rabbi Soloveitchik. He apparently preferred 7-Up. That's what he's drinking over here. Rabbi Lamb is directly to his left, but our right. Next to him is Rabbi Saul Berman. Unpictured is Rabbi Mordechai Willig, who actually, during the first year, delivered. He was the instructor. And behind, with her hands, with her fists folded to her cheek, is Dean Bacon. Well, what's gained or lost, Sarah, by Beit Midrash versus yeshiva?
The terminology is so interesting to me. First of all, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, but I think that they've since sort of walked that back, right? The GPATS program, the advanced Talmud program, or not just Talmud, the advanced learning program for women at Yeshiva University, started out as just a Beit Midrash, and then ultimately they decided to give master's credit for it. And ultimately they decided those would be credit courses. So I think that's like it's interesting that you raised the point about shifting it to Beit Midrash, because I think ultimately they shifted back. I think Beit Midrash is very important, but I think yeshiva, again, I think it's just a question of authenticity. I think right. I didn't know for a long time that people thought that women didn't learn in yeshiva. And I'm glad I didn't know that. But I think, without that, you can never, it just ties into all those other questions of authenticity, right? You can never get there if you haven't been there.
Beit Midrash was a much more domain neutral language than yeshiva. Yeshiva is where men go to study. Beit Midrash, though now it's interesting, is that many shuls are called a beis medrash, right? Now it's become sort of male space also. But as I am looking at this, reading it, reflecting on it, Beit Midrash, I sense that, and there were very astute public relations people at Yeshiva at the time, at YU at the time. Beit Midrash, they thought was an open term. waiting to be freighted with meaning. And if women could occupy Beit Midrash, that is a way to signal to everybody involved of what they were doing in the most authentic way possible. So much about authenticity is finding language that could be suitable and that we're unencumbered by other players and stakeholders.
But interesting to me that this doesn't seem like it was ever considered to be possibly a co-educational space.
No.
The women's Beit Midrash, but the idea that there would be men and women together in the Beit Midrash, and I think that's also important kind of messaging, right? If the Beis Medrash is closer to a shul almost, right? There, we're definitely separate there. And that led to a situation where you could have students who studied together at Ramaz, for example, right, a fully co-educational school, or at Maimonides, but then when it came to their higher level Beit Midrash learning, that could only be done separately.
Right, but, and yes, I agree that does change the dynamics a bit, but I think the historical actors are mollifying that concern by, number one, Rabbi Soloveitchik. Actually, he wasn't asked to do it. He asked to do it, deliver the inaugural Stern Talmud lecture, and for a Rosh Hashiva like Rabbi Mordechai Willig to be directing the program in its inaugural year, and that Rabbi Lamb is attending. And he's closer to the front than Karen Bacon is, looking at the students as some sort of dais over there. I think that when you have that level of clout, again, male clout, but again, who could you have at that moment? I don't think you could have had a female leader of that high repute delivering it. But when you have the Rosh Hashiva, so to speak, unofficially, deliver that lecture, would want to know if he had 7-Up in First Hall and Moshe Nights, I don't know. But I think that remedies some of that concern about, is this going to be different? Is it going to be, and some of what you're alluding to, I guess, is to use American juridical debate, is separate but equal. Yes, yeah. Separate, but if it's Rabbi Soloveitchik, then it's equal.
I'm not sure, actually. Like, I think that I always thought that, but now when I look at this picture, I actually think that as long as you have only men at the front of the room and only women as the recipients, then you were never setting up, you weren't actually moving towards a separate but equal system. That was never the intended trajectory here.
So I don't know about intentionality. That's interesting. I think I agree that when it gets executed, separate but equal did not work. We'll find out that the Stern Beit Midrash folded after a couple years before it was rejuvenated in the mid-'80s. But in terms of intention, I don't know, Rabbi Berman wrote a 40-year retrospective memoir of it. He included some of Rabbi Soloveitchik's language. From his perspective, I think he did everything in his power, although that being said, he was an older man, but he did not offer to give the class. It would have been hard for him. He had an apartment in Washington Heights. He was still commuting from Boston. But I don't know. It's interesting.
I'm not sure intention has to be as conscious as maybe I made it sound.
Okay.
But I think sort of, right, the end result of this was never going to be something that was really equal. This, in the same way as which I went to a high school that was fully coeducational for Talmud, and I graduated a long time ago. And to this day, they have never hired a woman to teach Talmud. And I don't think that's like an accident or a mistake, or like something that just sort of, fell by the wayside. I think that these things, again, intention is maybe a strong word, but things develop in certain ways, sometimes because of the way the system is set up.
Yeshiva world doesn't know what to do with the Stern Talmud program. In a private interview, it's really sad. We're talking about Olav Shalom and Zecher Tzadok Lebracha by so many people, but another person who succumbed to COVID-19 was the great sociologist Willy Helmreich. And in his interviews that are held in the Yeshiva University archives for the world of the yeshiva, this didn't make it into the book, but it's in the interviews. He interviewed Rabbi Aaron Schechter, now the leading rabbinic figure at Chaim Berlin, then the second in command to Rav Hutner at the time. He's reflecting in the late 1970s, right after the Stern Talmud program, and he tells Helmreich, again privately, talking about modern Orthodoxy and growing and shifting left, right, and the other way. Growth. Nope, I'm sorry, let me go a little bit further. The lack of leadership in the modern Orthodox world in this first full paragraph shows up everywhere. There are religious modernists who are rightists in their own camp, probably alluding to Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Lamb. And what do these rightists say? They establish a young women's base medrash. I mean, are we crazy? I assume was the intonation. The Allgemeiner Journal, most newspapers, most press simply just republished the Yeshiva University press release of the Stern Talmud program. The Allgemeiner Journal, which was not the official newspaper of the yeshiva world, but something close to it. Rav Soloveitchik, Zogd, Ersten Gemarischer, you don't have to know too much Yiddish to understand this, for Medelach in Stern College. So for Medelach, already tells you exactly what they think about it. They didn't use the Yiddish word for women. And here it's a little bit faded, but you can see that they talk about it as a beis medrash, as a yeshiva, and how the incongruity in this Yiddish press between Medelach learning and in the context of a men's arena, that being yeshiva Talmud study. And the modern Orthodox are getting in on both sides. So here you have Rabbi Harold Schulweis, passed away a few years ago. In an article, Rabbis Want to Know Women Need Apply. He is on the left flank, is a disciple of Mordechai Kaplan, always straddled between conservative Judaism and Reconstructionist Judaism. He offers, in this article, noteworthy and admirable, hopeful for the women's rabbinic leadership is the decision of the Orthodox Stern College for Women in New York to introduce an intensive courses in Talmudic studies for women, a course of studies introduced by none other than Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who offered its introductory Talmud here. So people are well aware of it. And all this from Orthodox leaders. Continues on. And so this is where I think some of it is shifting, is that women's Talmud cannot occupy just an educational space. It's freighted with way too much meaning to be siloed away from theological and religious import and behavior and gender spaces, as well as leadership positions. It need not be that way, right? Young men, boys, are taught Talmud from usually 6th grade. That's, I think, where the curriculum begins. Mishnah and Talmud onward, not specifically as a leadership position, but once you're introducing advanced Talmud, specifically for college-age women, then you are introducing the possibility of not just advanced Talmudic literacy, but Jewish literacy overall, and Talmud, and leadership, as well. We'll add one more source to the complexities of it, is that in the 1980s, there's much ado over women's prayer groups. Not too popular any longer. They exist, certainly. But in the 1980s, that was the major discussion point within the modern Orthodox world in the mid-1980s. It's also a chapter in the book. You have an invitation that was spread around town in Brooklyn about donation of a new Sefer Torah in 1984. And there was a debate in the Jewish press between Erwin Hout. His wife, Rivka Hout, was one of the champions of women's prayer. Why it was her rabbinic husband who debated and not she, although she participated, is really interesting. I'm not exactly sure why, but even most telling is Rabbi Louis Bernstein, president of the Rabbinical Council of America, who's been, they've been begging him have the women's prayer, no, here I'm conflating it, women's prayer proponents, for the RCA to not just acknowledge, but to sanction women's prayer on the grounds that it basically looks like a Beis Yaakov homeroom. We heard the same argument, writes Rabbi Bernstein, on mixed pews, and the back and forth in the Jewish press goes on for months between the two. Unfortunately, so many stood their ground, so it's like conservative Judaism. Torah study for women, yes. Co-opting of our most able men and women for communal leadership, yes. So here's introducing leadership, maintaining the traditional sanctity of the synagogue, most emphatically, yes. So women cannot have their own prayer groups. this clearly indicates that I disagree with Rabbi Gilbert Kamen, the immediate past president of the Rabbinical Council of America, who left advocating for it. And so here, there are people who are suggesting, well, if RCA and modern Orthodoxy and Rabbi Soloveitchik, who was about to really resign himself from public life just around this time in December 1985, women's Talmud cannot decouple itself, to Sarah, to use your word, from other variables, from the ordination of women in the conservative movement beginning in 1984, with women's prayer. Again, not offering judgment one way or the other, but the inability to extricate it from other variables was then impossible.
I so often wonder what would have happened if they had said yes. I do think that it turned out to be a slippery slope, but I'm not sure if the slippery slope, to use their phrase, but I'm not sure if the slippery slope is because, I think it might actually be because the response was no. I think if you get told no too many times, that creates its own reaction. And I just sometimes wonder about this alternative reality in which they've been like, you know what, sure, go have your women's prayer groups. They're not minyanim, they'll never be minyanim. It's basically a Beis Yaakov homeroom, as you said. You go do that and let us know how that goes for you. I'm so curious if you have thoughts about how that could have played out.
I once wrote an article of counter history and promised never to do that again. But it's interesting. I wonder a lot what, because there's so many variables that are at play here, what do yeses or nos, and one, how does it have cause and effect for other spaces as well? And I think you're right. I think that women's prayer had a lot of implications. Then the very fierce no had a lot of severe implications for women's leadership and women's Talmud, because the champions of those other points in those, they couldn't find a space of they couldn't find a room of their own.
Right. Yeah, and I think also it played, for me experientially, there was a real conversation there about authenticity as well. That despite the fact that there were, it was hard, similar to women's Talmud, but actually I think more so than women's Talmud study, very hard to prove from the sources that such a thing was prohibited, probably because it's not. And I think, again, this was my experience, at least being sort of inside of it, is that once women realized that even a strong Talmud background, and even knowing all the sources and knowing that you were right on this point wasn't going to help you win the argument. So then the argument officially became about something else. And that's where I see that trajectory really sort of taking hold, or that slippery slope really kicking in.
And here's the source testifying to the fact that the women's baby drash program at Stern College was their language dissolved by 2 years later. It reemerged in the 80s again. It came back with a major comeback in the late 90s with GPAS, with the Advanced Women's Talmud program at Stern College, which exists, of course, until this day. And it's happening also, you mentioned Frisch, Sir Rabbi Menachem Meir, who is the principal at the time. He brings Rabbi Soloveitchik in to observe co-education and women's Talmud. In the early 80s, one of their yearbooks testifies to this moment. And it's happening in Yeshiva Flatbush, although only to honors students. Non-honors young women in 11th, 12th grade either get an extra halacha class or home ec. There are other options, and it's very also hard, is that many of the teachers in what we would call today modern Orthodox day schools, they're being staffed, because there's a shortage, by rabbis, men, who don't necessarily subscribe to Rabbi Soloveitchik's point of view. Many of them, for example, from Ner Yisrael, and Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, who was a leading figure there, was at the time the Rosh Kola, but eventually becomes Rosh Yeshiva. He is on the record, and he is a major voice within Torah Masorah, very clear that we do not teach women Talmud, and if the school is co-ed, then better not to teach boys Talmud than to teach them cooperatively Gemara. So part of it is a supply and demand issue, but also, and this is what we talked about late last week, is that American Orthodoxy develops very gendered. Right? So much of its parting of the ways with conservative Judaism was over mixed eating. So the idea of separating men and women in their different spaces was a fixture in American Orthodox discourse early on. And even though we don't have slides for this, I thought maybe just to mention it here, discuss it a little bit. We've already mentioned how Israel represents the great comeback of women's Talmud in so many ways, is that Israel's not as encumbered by gender separate spaces. And even when they are, about curricular differences between the two. American Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy comes really out of a vision from leaders of the Orthodox Union and Yeshiva University that fancy themselves to be the successors to Volozhin Yeshiva, an exclusively men's space. And it has a lot more success as women's Talmud, therefore, in seminaries in Israel. There are a lot of heroines for this. Malki Bina comes to mind. In some sense, Nechama Leibovich, certainly, Rabbanit Henkin, Rabbanit Lichtenstein, in supporting, he referred to his daughter starting Migdal Oz and teaching there. And, there are many people on this call who know better than I do, is that when sometimes they need a substitute teacher, Rabbanit Lichtenstein or other Ramim, leading rabbinic figures at Yeshivat Har Etzion would substitute at Migdal Oz, and having male and female teachers in Israel, and not to be weighted down necessarily from this politic, and having so many issues up in the air, really supported a flowering of women's Talmud in Israel much more so than in America.
I think it's interesting you say that they were less encumbered by separation. I find things overall to be more separate in Israel. I think what you're describing is male and female teachers, but still teaching to an all-female Beit Midrash when you talk about Migdal Oz. When I learned in Beit Marasha for a year, and I was in a program with women who had a very, very strong Talmud education. By definition, that was the only way they got to be in the program. And at one point I was learning with my chavruta, and I mentioned something about my chavruta in high school. And I said something about what he used to say to me. And she said, "Oh, now I understand why you're so good at Gemara. You learned with the boys." And that was a really shocking moment to me. And I realized that none of the other women in the Beit Midrash had gone to school with boys. Not a single one of them. I was literally the only person. So I think there is something about gender separation there, but I'm not sure it breaks down exactly in that way.
No, you're right. I didn't mean to oversimplify, but take us. I switched the slides to a program that you were so much part of. Maybe you could speak to more than my point in raising this. Preface your remarks over here is that this program happens in Israel for a reason, not in America. You have to travel on a 12-hour flight to get to this. You can't do this in America.
For sure. And I think that point is very well taken. And I do think you're right in that they were somehow successful. I actually think maybe because there's more gender separation in Israel, that this program and others were successful in carving out all female space. I mean, there were men present. If you kind of look at the audience picture, maybe you'll be able to see there were men present, but it was not the majority by any stretch of the imagination. It was women run, women organized, women led. It was a celebration of women's Talmud study.
What is it? I moved us too far ahead. If we take a step back, what are we looking at?
Oh, so we're looking at the Hadran, the women's Daf Yomi Siyum that took place in Jerusalem on January 5th. This year. Michelle Cohen-Farber, who's she's in the top photo. You can see her in sort of like a patterned dark blue dress. She's holding a piece of paper in her hand, and her head's kind of turned to the side. So thank you. She was actually my teacher in Midrash Lindemem years ago, and she started a women's Daf Yomi group in her home. Started teaching Daf Yomi daily. Eventually started a podcast. And really started to kind of leverage that. I think this is a trend that you speak about, Zev, the way that American women are really influential in Israel, but they're American women. So Michelle is American, her husband is American, her supporters, I mean, if you look through the names of the people who are on her board and joined this, they're all American. They're all American families. You would recognize all of their names. And they created this really massive event. I think they said 3,000 people. And that's just the people they could see. They had overflow crowds watching on large screens, and they also live streamed it all over the world. And congregations all over the world, such as ours, co-sponsored, participated, whatever, had learners and were broadcast on the big screen. And it was a really, really amazing event that celebrated women's Talmud study in this very female-dominated space.
We have our goals of the time, which are very women-centered, although it says they're offering women at all levels of knowledge and tools they need to study Talmud. They acknowledge a historical moment, which is really important. And one thing that came up in our conversation and preparing our remarks here is that they're awash in color. We're talking about intentionality or not, whereas the Sima Shas, always sponsored by the Aguda in New York a few days earlier, was incredibly two-tone, black and white. Here you have women on stage, some dressed in just the way that they would study Gemara, right? They're wearing, nobody's too informal, and maybe that's Israeli culture. Maybe I'm digging too deep here. But the splash of color, even in the background, that you have the blues and the purples, and as a Baltimore Ravens fan, I only imagine everybody is a great supporter of our football team. But the fact that not to say that it's becoming more feminine because of the color, but it's becoming different because of the color.
I actually am so appreciative that you made that point to me, Zev, because I didn't think about it. I almost didn't think about it at all when I was there. I didn't think about the background and the overall color. But now that you say it, I do think it's really true that a sense of kind of like, this is who we are, this is how we come to study Talmud, and not a sense of kind of having to hold back. Like we weren't trespassing in a male space. That was, I think, a big message of the evening. But really, this is like a women's space, and it's natural for women to study Talmud and natural for us all to come together in this way.
We see on our goals, the last three words, the world of Talmud. It's not a yeshiva, and in fact, they acknowledge people on all levels. This is a deliberate choice, I think. Not to go with, we're creating a yeshiva, a Beit Midrash, a this or a that. We're the world of Talmud. We're part of that remarkable time at the very beginning in Jewish history. And maybe the color is trying to eschew any narrower designation of what is women's or what is men's space over here.
And you saw that also in the speakers. There was, you could be, a quasi Rosh Hashiva. I don't know, Rabbanit Sara, if that's how you would think, how Esty Rosenberg would sort of define herself. But you can, sort of be a Torah leader, but definitely not someone who takes on a rabbinic role, right? None of those voices were included in this celebration. Okay, Rosh Beit Midrash, thank you. So yeah, you could be a Rosh Beit Midrash. That was Rabbanit Michal Tukachinsky's title as well when I studied with her, and she was on the stage as well. But definitely not anybody who had, a quasi-rabbinic role. And it was clear that was quite intentional in the design of this space. They were very, very careful. And I think that's a difference also in the American and Israeli scene. I think you see more initiatives in Israel that are sort of content to be really, really careful in not rocking the boat. And in America, if that phase existed at all, I feel it was very, very short.
What is interesting here, though, is there is a movement, a grassroots one, in Israel to elevate women's Talmud. And in America, they receive it it's ironic is that my argument is that Rabbi Soloveitchik might have championed women's Talmud in the 30s, 40s, and 50s onward, and 77 is this marquee moment, although people don't remember that the program was rather moribund a few years later, is that whatever success, or I'd say in the main, the success of women's Talmud here in the United States has just as much to do with the return migration. You had Anglos making Aliyah, being successful in women's Talmud in Israel, and then they or their students bringing it back overseas to the United States, meaning it's that cross-pollination of providing whatever spearheaded, whatever stimulus is happening in Israel coming back to America. What that does suggest, though, here is that there is an attempt, again, to commingle women's Talmud and leadership, even at a grassroots level, that's happening in Israel. In this program, you take a look at just how sort of pulverizing this people in attendance are. And as you point out, there are more people. That's only because the auditorium can only fit so many people. What, though, happens in America, what's happening right now, is that leadership is still happening for women. And in fact, here is some cross-tabbing of the recent Pew data. It's not going to be so recent. I think the Pew Forum is going to come out with an updated study of American Jews in short order. But we have from the 2013 study is that one question asked was about intellectual curiosity. How important intellectual curiosity is to your Jewishness? A rather ambiguous term, intellectual curiosity, I admit. But you see that here in the top left, you have some numbers, is that all Jews report, here's blue being essential, orange being important but not essential. Here is how all Jews registered, and conservative and reform are basically on par with the all Jews, and the Orthodox are somehow below on intellectual curiosity, which was noted in the summary report for the Pew Forum. But if you actually take a deeper dive, you'll see that Orthodox, which because of the way that questions were arranged, could be opened up into Orthodox, well, into non-Orthodox, Hasidic, and Yeshivish. Again, terms which don't necessarily capture everything, but you see that modern Orthodox actually performed higher on intellectual curiosity as essential to one's Jewishness than conservative reform or all Jews. It was what was lagging behind for it. Again, not to offer a judgment, but just to look at the numbers. Hasidic and Yeshivish, in terms of intellectual curiosity, they fell far behind the modern Orthodox. Modern Orthodox are only about 1/3 now of the Orthodox, overall Orthodox community. So that's why that number over here is much lower. Most interesting, though, is that if you open up Yeshivish women and men as being the composite score. So we take the Yeshivish category, and now you look at just women and just men. You see that Yeshivish men perform like Hasidic Jews, right here. But Yeshivish women, and again, intellectual curiosity is a nebulous sort of term, perform like modern Orthodox Jews at the highest. See, there is this groundswell. I was thinking about 1917, 1918 with Sar Schneer and the Beis Yaakov movement, which again did not support women's Talmud, but definitely did try to expand the women's curriculum, and it's worth acknowledging that contribution out loud about 100 years ago, is that Yeshivish women are still hungering for intellectual curiosity, according to this Pew report. But it's coming out in really interesting ways. So you have women's leadership, and here you have an article by the Harvard Law professor Noah Feldman here in the middle. But you have on the left side an important court case in Portland, Oregon, about the wives of their Kollel fellows reserving clerical privilege, that they do not have to, that with, I think it was regarding a case of divorce, that the Rebbitzins, that's their term, Rebbitzins, of the Kollel men did not need to divulge. They were protected. Whatever information that was shared with them was protected by clerical privilege because they too are clergy. They have a leadership role. And so women are activating, and they're even arguing it in a court of law, that they have a leadership role, although not within the province of Talmud study. And here you also have an interesting quote that I'll just put up here but not review, but you have in the OU responsum about women's leadership, and this brings us full circle, is the idea of Masorah. Masorah can mean so many things in Orthodox discourse, so I won't even try to define it. But one piece of text, and I thank Laura Shaw Frank for being so kind of pointing me to it a couple of months ago. The idea of Masorah is this is the, I believe, 2017 rabbinic panel discussion about women's leadership that was sponsored, that was convened by the Orthodox Union. The idea of Masorah is often mistaken as a mere historical record of Jewish practice. Masorah isn't what best approximates the religious dealings of the Gaon of Vilna or Maimonides or Rashi or Moses. That misunderstanding, combined with both the absence of historical uniformity of normative practice and the gradual evolution of halacha, can be misconstrued as compromising the authenticity of Masorah. Authentic Masorah is rather an appreciation for and application of tradition as the guide by which new ideas, challenges, and circumstances are navigated. So you didn't even need my book. All you needed was this paragraph, which I think is totally on point. And at least in this paragraph assumption here, is that what works well in tradition-bound faiths is if everything is toggled in such a way in its historical, sociological, and cultural underpinnings and circumstances are all clicked on and seem authentic. Women's Talmud and the challenges we've seen, both the highs and the lows, are all part of the tensions of trying to do religion in an incredibly complex space. Women's Talmud, and probably to Rabbi Soloveitchik's chagrin, could never be separated, decoupled from other issues, whether it be women's leadership writ large, women's prayer, women in the rabbinate, gender issues, masculinity, and whatever is connoted by the term yeshiva. All of these ideas are attached to religion. When everything lines up, where it can be presented, and that's why I think discourse and even images and even color, technicolor, can signal what is or what isn't authentic. As shallow as it might be, they're important for how we message religion. So much so, as I argue, is that it's not always about shifting to the left or to the right. I think that's way too linear. It's three-dimensional, and Zoom allows me to show three-dimension in a way that I couldn't in the classroom or from a pulpit. It's so much about the 360-degree mapping of each and every variable, what it looks like, and it can't ignore what's happening in other spaces, which other people would want to leave out from the conversation. But it's happening, and what is deemed as authentic or inauthentic, and whether it's the left or the right or the center of any tradition bound, of any religion, of any space, it doesn't have to be a religion. The historical actors can't but have to answer to all of those different variables to make the argument for what is or what isn't authentic. Back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is all true. So I think you're the historian. I think you have the advantage, where you can say, you know what happened, so you can describe those things. And like you said, you're not going to write a counter history of what could have happened. But I guess, having been there for a lot of this, I do think about some of that. And ultimately, I am not sure. I think that I still think that some of Israel's victories, if you want to call it that, some of their achievements are because they somehow were able to separate things out. But I'm not sure that I feel negatively about the inability of sort of American orthodoxy to separate things out. I think that Talmud study should be linked with leadership at the end of the day.
But I would even look at it as a practitioner, and I'm not going to exonerate you from responsibility here, is that part of this book and getting so up to date, which is always very scary for a historian. It's like, as you say, when you know the ending, you can make whatever, especially if the people are no longer living, right? No problem about writing about religious reform in the 19th century. Everybody's deceased.
Right.
You know, Isaac Mayer Wise can't come back from the dead and clobber me for misunderstanding his editorial comments. When it comes to a much more modern and contemporary period, I think that as we move forward and people, I think as trying to be as non-normative, I think that it's very clear where I fall out on this. And, as a daughter of a 7-year-old girl, father of a 7-year-old girl, I definitely have my opinions on this, and I definitely support it. We had to see him on Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos is a very hard thing to learn. I'll peep shots with young people, especially as you go into like the 4th and the 5th prakim, or even the 5th Mishnah even. That being said, I think that in counter history, while I might have become damaged goods and I never want to write counter history again, I think that as we plan forward, it's interesting to see about where the coalescence of issues come into play, and if we can block the one for being a variable, and if we can message, or if we can architect a program that which neutralizes an issue, that's useful, right? Going back to counter history and saying, well, what if such and such a thing didn't happen? So what if in a path forward, if we're trying to move the needle on women's Talmud, or just Talmud in general, not to say that we haven't figured it out for the men either. If we want to neutralize certain variables and how we telegraph and how we furnish curriculum and how we just position ourselves moving forward, counter history is a nifty way of trying to experiment and say, because counter history is how we learn from history. If we don't want to fall into the same traps, then I think your question about, well, what happens if we, if women's Talmud and women's prayer crash into one another, appropriately or inappropriately, and if we see that, and I make the argument that it certainly had an effect on both, then moving forward, how do we neutralize that, or is it a factor anymore? And if we're trying to separate it from women's leadership, how do we telegraph that women's Talmud isn't necessary? It might be, and it might be that we're interested in that, but how can we augur it in such a way in which we have negated or neutralized that variable? In that sense, I think that it's not historians who engage in counter history, it's the practitioners, right? It's the champions of, and people, the thought leaders who are moving it forward, who are thinking about, who are using history and trying to realign its course. So I think maybe it's not my article to write, but it's yours.
Yeah, and I think I'll disappoint you maybe. I don't think that I'm any more in a place where where that's the lesson that I would want to learn. Like, what if we could have separated it out? How can we reassure people that this really is authentic? I don't think that I'm there anymore. I know it's like lahavdil, but I heard Deborah Lipstadt speak, Professor Deborah Lipstadt, historian. She writes about anti-Semitism. She speaks about anti-Semitism. And I've heard her speak a number of times, but one thing that she said that really stuck with me is she said that sometimes people have the idea that if you just, if we just explain to the anti-Semites that like, no, like this is really how Jews are, and this is, the Holocaust really did happen. Like if we could just sort of mass enough evidence, they won't be anti-Semites anymore. Like it'll be okay. And that part of her work is showing that is not actually the case. And I feel that way a little bit when I read some of these historical documents and read your book. I think at the time I felt like, well, we're just trying to convince you that this really is halachic and we really do have good intentions and we really are Orthodox. And that failed. And I don't think, I don't necessarily think anymore that the path forward is through those arguments.
Also, it could be that the path forward leverages these historical moments and say this is not the right rhetoric. This is just not the conversation I want to revive anymore. And that too is learning from a counter history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your discourse around authenticity is really helpful in that sense. As I said, that it's not, we can stop saying, well, we're like, it did happen, it didn't happen. We do have a source for it in the Talmud. We don't have a source, right? Like, Bruria, yes, no, right? Like we can sort of say, at a certain point, we're changing facts on the ground. And this is the authentically lived experience of so many Orthodox men and women, so many Orthodox people, that is what will ultimately make it feel authentic.
Amazing. All right. Those are better closing words than I can offer. So I'll thank you so much. I can only speak for myself. Is that what I love in so much in this period, and hopefully this is one of the last times that we're doing these things by Zoom. But Sarah, you've really energized me with your remarks, with your comments, your insight. So from where I'm sitting, thank you so much.
Such a fun conversation, and I'm glad that that this was recorded and so many people attended, and really want to thank Dr. Zev Eleff for taking the time, because this was a fascinating conversation for me as well.
Benjamin, of course, thank you so much for spearheading this, making sure this happened. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you both so much for doing this and for sharing your wisdom with us.
Always the sources.
I want to put in also a plug for the book. Zev, you were very modest and didn't overemphasize, even though a lot of the sources come. But I think it's still for sale. Is that correct?
Yes, if you want to, I just put the link in the chat. You can also just go to the ASB website and find it under the website under the event. But if you still want to order the book, you can. It's heavily discounted, which is wonderful, and it will be sent directly to you.
Great. I can be assured that it has no implication on the royalties. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Ask a question, or is it too late? Oh, he's gone already.
You can message me.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, Sarah, I guess I'd be interested in what Zev thinks also, but I often think about it in terms of like aesthetics. Like there's like an aesthetic of orthodoxy that women really struggle to achieve, meaning like, oh, maybe women like can call themselves rabbis, but they're never gonna have a beard, and they're never gonna have a deep voice, and they're never gonna look like rabbis. And I think so much of like feminism, so much of like the like Orthodox writing, like the Rav Moshe kind of writing about feminism, it's all about like how it looks, how it makes you feel in your kishkas. Like it's not, as you said, like it's not like, oh, let's make an argument about Bruria. And then for me, the question is like, how do women and synagogues that employ women, like what does that mean in terms of going the extra mile to like look Orthodox? Because it's actually not about the sources, it's about people's kishkas.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a real question, but I think my answer is still the same. Like, I think it's just going to change facts on the ground. I mean, first of all, I want to say that's not an Orthodox problem, right? That problem exists 100% in the other movements. And I know that you know that, right? I forget what the stats are right now, but right, like conservative shuls, large conservative shuls having female rabbis, senior rabbis, not a thing. Right? I think
I'm an upcoming manel.
Yes, for details, right? I think the year that I was hiring, because we hired a Reform rabbi, the year that I was hiring at Princeton, I think not a single Reform woman graduating that year got a pulpit, like not one. So I think that is like that is not the optics or the aesthetics of Orthodoxy. That's the aesthetics of rabbis. And I don't know that there's any other way to change that beyond like the way we sort of have it here, where, my children think, oh, like, daddy's a rabbi, Rabbanit Sara is a rabbi, and rabbi for them is like a pretty, I'd say, broad category of, people who teach Torah and do certain things in the shul. And I think that's also relevant to that piece. Like, it's not about arguing, like, can you give psak? Can you not give psak? One thing that Zev didn't speak about, but I think is really interesting, is like just the broadening of the term rabbi in general, which is also something that the conservative and reform movements in America, I think, started, right? Like, I don't know. Anyone know more history than I do, but like that wasn't right. Like it wasn't, Yeshiva University didn't have a pastoral counseling program 50 years ago, I'm going to say, I think. right? Like that wasn't a thing. So I think we are anyway changing the definition of what rabbi looks like, and I think we'll keep doing that probably.
Well, that's what like Adam Ferziger writes about this, right? That like, is it the Protestant model of rabbi or the Catholic model of rabbi? Like the Protestant model would be like you have all these pastoral responsibilities, and the Catholic model would be like I do sacraments and rites that other people cannot do. And he argues that like the OU statement about women rabbis is a very like Catholic statement. Like women can do all of that like soft stuff, but like here's what they can't do. They can't officiate at events. They can't, but like trying to define kind of sacramentally what the rabbinate is.
Right. And I think that's just a very top-down definition of what the rabbinate is that maybe possibly won't endure. Right. I'm thinking
that it was made up for the occasion and never existed.
That definition for sure. But even just like the idea that that like, well, if you can't make the menu, you can't like, officiate at the thing, then you're not going to be a good rabbi. I think it really all depends on sort of like where you sit. Like, do you remember now that, this is your like part of your farewell, right? When you were hired and so that was 2 years ago. So Sophie, our daughter, was 6 and I was walking with her and she asked me, will Rabbanit Sara teach classes? And I said, yes. And she said, will she, help with the kids program? I said, yes. Right. Will she give drushas? I said, yes. And then she said, but will she know how to give out lollipops? And I said, yes, they taught her that in school too. Right. So there's like, 60 kids when, God willing, we're back in shul. There's like 60 people every week for whom definitional to the role of the rabbi is that they give out lollipops on the bima. Doesn't really matter if you can, lead Shabbat Brachot or not. And that's, I know I'm taking an extreme with children, but I think that, rabbis are different things to different people at different times. I think that's just going to continue to be the case.
Yeah.
I hope. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Thanks.
I was thinking about
some of those pastoral roles were things that were, things that rabbis did, but weren't like codified as official roles of the rabbi. And I think some of those pastoral roles were also things that the Rebbitzin did without official, payment position, other than married to rabbi, therefore an integral part of supporting the community.
For sure.
So I think as that kind of model broke down, you probably had to actively reinsert it into pastoral life.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true too.
And something interesting that I might have my history wrong, but now there's no historian here to fact check me, is I think the way the conversation went in the conservative and Orthodox worlds were really very opposite. And that my understanding is that in the 70s, the conservative conversation was, what do rabbis do? And then a bunch of visual things. So to get women to be rabbis, we have to allow them to do all these visual things. And now that women can count in minyanim and lead services and read Torah, now women can be rabbis. Whereas in the Orthodox world, the process seems to have been rabbi is the same first step, but the opposite conclusion, which has always struck me as weird because I don't really think of rabbis as people who read Torah or lead services or count in minyanim in particular.
If you have an educated and capable lay community, the rabbi isn't necessarily there for that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of rabbis aren't very good at reading Torah or leading services.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Doesn't make them not rabbis.
It's true. They're and certainly in a lot of yeshivish communities, they're there to be halachic arbiters. So if then someone else with a nicer voice leads davening,
Someone else who's better at learning laning than does the laning.
I wonder.
Go ahead.
I wonder if this is connected at all to the, I guess, collapse almost of the role of chazan as a shul office. I think if you said to someone 100 years ago that leading services and reading Torah is a significant part of a rabbi's job, they would have looked like you have 5 heads, because that was the chazan's job. And that was a different shul office that was mostly about doing ritual roles that we don't, I mean, they still exist, but not as widely as they did 100 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's all, like I said, it's hard to go back and sort of quarterback like what might have happened and, what did and didn't happen as a result of what might have happened. But I definitely think that's all part of it. And I think it's also regional. I mean, I did not push Zev hard, but I don't think that Ida Crown is a coeducational school. And I grew up in a community where most of the men were rabbis. And it wasn't such a big deal to be a rabbi. Everyone got smicha at some point. And then, you just like moved on with your life. You either served a shul or you didn't serve a shul. So I think there are regional differences also that make every community a little bit different. And maybe that's also, Israel is smaller. Maybe that's also a piece of it.
I'm curious, what's your definition of a truly co-ed school?
They have all their classes together.
Fair.
I mean, like, it's not even, I wouldn't even say, when you say my definition, usually I think that would be something that like I had to like think a lot about, or like I created my definition. Like, it's not like that, just like I went to a high school that was co-ed and I thought that what that word meant was that we were together all the time. And then I got here and they were like, oh, Ida Crown is co-ed. And I was like, no, it's not. Like, I don't understand. Like, how does that word, I don't think that word means what you think it means. Like,
you say that because I was thinking that as, I was like, when that was dropped in as co-ed, I was like, I'm pretty sure they have their classes separate. Like their Judaic class is separate, so.
Yeah,
I was wondering how much that, like, wondering during the conversation, how much that sort of like ability to like silo boys and girls separately leads to the ability to say we can do separate things with them. Because if your like principle in the first place is they are going to be in the same classes all together, then it could, I think maybe he brought up a source that could go either way. Like either you don't teach any of them Talmud, or then you have to teach the girls the same Talmud.
right.
I wonder how much that can be a factor in very easily teaching girls Talmud.
Definitely. And I think it also like speaks to the kind of signaling and aesthetics that you mentioned, Rabbanit Sara. I remember when I went to Midrash Lindenbaum, my Ram had been involved in recruitment for a while, and he told us that when he went to recruit at the all-girls high school near me, like in New Jersey at Berea, the head of school, Mrs. Newberger, told him, our parents don't want their girls going to school with girls who have gone to school with boys.
That's how strong the cooties are.
Yeah, that is exactly what I said. That's
how strong the liberalism is.
Yeah, but so I think that there, it's not just, like, I think you're right about the curricular choices, Vinny, for sure, but I think that there's also like a stronger messaging that kind of developed over time. Like, we send our kids to an all-boys school, we send our kids to an all-girls school, so we're not just that it's a different group, but like not associated with those other people, right? We're like in a different space from those other people who think that education can happen all together. And that like became a strong difference.
Do you think those things developed side by side? Because it seems that if your goal is to not teach one or girls Talmud, then having them in one school with separate classes works fine. And you have this other value of not wanting your girls and your boys to associate with each other until they're 19 years old and ready to get married. So I'm just curious if you think that those two were separate streams that developed in parallel, and then the result kind of ended up being a little bit the same, so they started mixing. Or I don't know if you have any way of knowing that.
I'm not the historian, so I don't know. I will just say that I was fascinated when Zev said that like there was a economic aspect to having schools be
Yeah.
co-ed. That makes so much sense to me, but I also think that sometimes economics are kind of like a good test of how closely held your religious beliefs are, right?
Yeah.
Like we really believe in separate education, but if it's a choice between, separate education and not having a day school, we choose having a day school and having them be together. Right? Like something about the willing, right? But like they wouldn't compromise on day school. I don't know. Like I think the choices that you make about what you're willing to compromise on, right? It wasn't like there was no money. It was like there was a choice about how to spend that money, and it's unbalanced, right? Like coeducation is not so terrible. It wasn't the worst thing they could think of. I find that really interesting. Right. The worst thing they could think of was public school, right? So this was not the worst thing. So I find that really interesting, especially in the wake of the schools developed after. And I do think that some of the most successful schools in teaching Talmud to women certainly have been all girls schools and opportunities, like the midrashot or yeshivot in Israel. I think if anyone's interested, I really do think you should read like Zev's book, and especially the chapter on women's Talmud and the chapter on women's prayer groups. I think are really, really fascinating. And I mean, it could be partially because I was there for most of what he's describing, but I think it's interesting. I think I would find it interesting anyway.
Can I challenge you on something you just said though? Like I felt like I went to my humanities, I learned bechavrusa with boys all the way through, like definitely like I was as good if not better than any of them. And then the ones who went to Gush or like that level of yeshiva experience in Israel, when they came out, they'd just been exposed to so much more than I had. And I went to Migdal Oz, like, I don't know what it is now exactly, but like at the time that was the absolute best, like A+ yeshiva for women, or whatever they would call yeshiva, midrashah for women. And like definitely the men came out just like more literate than I was, like having just been, because of the type of yeshiva that's available to men that does not exist on the planet for women, which is, right, a yeshiva with people who are Shana Aleph all the way through like in the last stages of studying for the rabbinate, like that there's nowhere that exists for women. Maybe Lindenbaum now, but even then those programs don't like mix together. You're not exposed on the same level that you have in these men's yeshivot. And I think like, yes, like of course my learning grew by leaps and bounds in Israel in a way that it didn't in day school, also because that's what I was doing all day long. But in so many ways the women's yeshivot are not what the men's yeshivot are. So.
Totally. I think that's true. I think when I said like that they were successful, I meant sort of communally, and I mean more the high schools. I think on a yeshiva level, I ultimately think that the bid for separate but equal in so many places and in so many ways did not work out. Turns out that's not a true story. I really think that that's the upshot. What you said also made me think of, just in case anyone hasn't read Alana Blumberg's book, which I think is called Houses of Study, about women's Talmud study. I forgot to ask Zev about it. It's such a fun book, or sad fun book. And she has this amazing line where she says that like she went to Midrash Unimam. She thought she was going to yeshiva. When she got there, she discovered that everyone called it seminary. And she says like, the following year, I think she went to Barnard or she went to Columbia. She said like, it doesn't make a difference, but like no one told me when I got to Columbia that the word I was looking for wasn't exactly university. Like no one tried that on me. So like to be told like, oh, it's not actually yeshiva, like right, that's a crazy thing in and of itself. So I do think that on some level, having these separate spaces hasn't been, or it just depends on your definition of success, right? Like I think the women at Hadron felt that they were very successful, but their goals were different.
I may get into trouble for this. So I went to yeshiva, and now I joined yeshiva, now I retired. Is the difference the intensity? I view yeshiva as a battle.
I lost internet.
You fight sleep deprivation. You don't get what you want there. It's learning nonstop. Tremendous sleep deprivation. When I was in yeshiva, I fought sleep all the time. And I fought to keep myself up. So is that part of the issue? In yeshiva, the reason why a guy going to Gush is because he's learning 24 hours, well, not 24 hours. We're learning, 15 to 18 hours a day. Is that one of the issues?
think we might have lost Sarah for a second, but I'll chime in. My experience at McDonald's was like my first Seder in the morning started at 5:45 a.m. and I was in the Beit Midrash until 12:30. Like that was a very normal thing, but and I was not alone on that kind of timetable. But for me, it was much more about exposure, about what kinds of classes were being offered, about what kinds of expectations there were, and not about like the suffering per se.
You know, Yeshiva is Gemara, Gemara, and Gemara again. They throw in some Chumash. Okay.
This is in the Gemara.
Both.
But it could also, I think a lot of it could like maybe that certain kind of intensity or a certain kind of lack of course offerings could be in large part to the fact that like in the vast majority of the Orthodox world, the women who are doing that learning aren't like, it's not seen as like, this is then going to be the next step in your life of like going on to be a rabbi. It's still like, you're learning this and you're going to go on to do whatever your real life is going to be. But for like the men, if any of them could become a rabbi, but it's not the same, it doesn't have the same attitude towards the women's study.
And no one's like I think for men there's like a performative masculinity element to yeshiva that women don't have. So for women, they're there not to like become anything, it's to like find spiritual fulfillment. And so it's like, okay, how do I do that? Is the Gemara that for me, or is it Chassidut, or is it Chumash? Let me explore all of those paths, which then mean that for someone like me who like was very much interested in keeping up with like the masculine model, like that was actually kind of a lonely endeavor, because I wasn't interested as much in like Chassidut and whatever, or spiritual fulfillment for that matter.
Right, I think that's where the Israeli schools have succeeded, right, in that definition of success. They've said like, oh, Gemara is also a good option for women's spiritual fulfillment. And so they've been really successful in that model. I think there was a very, I don't know that Zev agrees with this, but I feel that in America, there was like a really, really short window of time where that was like a thing. I think that there was this really brief time period where women's tefillah groups were on the rise, and there was the Scholar Circle at Drisha, which was designed just for women to be Torah scholars, but not anything more. Meaning there was no discussion about leadership roles. You were going to really, really know a lot of Torah, and that was like, I think that maybe lasted like 10 years, maybe at most, before people, wanted something more.
I can tell you exactly when it ended. It was 2013.
Oh no, I think way before that.
No, Rachel Rosenthal was the last student.
Oh, sorry, that's when the Scholar Circle ended. But the idea that it was going to be about spiritual fulfillment, that ended way before that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I know exactly when the Scholar Circle ended also. But I would say that between the time that Noah Jesselson graduated and the time that I got there, that feeling had already eroded. So I'm not sure how much older she is than I am. Maybe 8 years, I think, approximately, something like that. Old enough so that she was my very, very young high school teacher. So I was a sophomore in high school. She had just graduated Stern College. Yeah, that's like not a lot of years. Yeah. Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks for taking the time.
I hope everyone will read Zev's book. And good to see you all.
Yeah, good to see you too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And you can order it still on the website if you want.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Bye.